Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm thrilled to have with us today Richard Ma, who is the CEO at Quantstamp. Quantstamp is a fantastic firm, super interesting, one of the first blockchain audit and security companies in the space that has been doing great work across Web3 now for many years. And that, of course, gives Richard a really interesting seat to the ecosystem and everything that's been going on there. With that, Richard, welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, really appreciate having me on here. So,
how did you end up creating Quantstamp? Where did the idea come from? And can you talk a little bit about what it felt like? What was the environment? What were the trends? And kind of how are you thinking about the moment?
Basically, I was a high-frequency trader. I had, invested in Ethereum quite early on in 2016. I invested in the DAO, which was like the first big project on Ethereum. About, 2 or 3 weeks after investing in the DAO, it was actually hacked for over $50 million. That gave me, the reason to start Quantstamp, because during the hack, it was kind of like very chaotic. I started to really dig into the security side for Ethereum.
What does it mean when you say it was hacked? What actually happened with the DAO and its smart contracts?
Yeah, so basically in the DAO smart contracts, there was a bug. It was called a reentrancy bug. And it basically allowed the attacker to withdraw more money than they were putting in. And it's really due to sort of how the smart contracts code was ordered. So because of this sort of technicality and the fact that, all the money in Ethereum is just in these publicly accessible contracts, the hacker was able to basically take advantage of this bug and steal the ether. So that's sort of the summary of it.
Yeah, so I'm going to go straight for the jugular off the bat. And I remember that moment, and it led to the Ethereum fork, Ethereum Classic, and the Ethereum that we have today, and was really an existential moment. And one of the things that people kept saying was, code is law. So whatever the code executes is kind of holy, sacred, and should be respected. And forking the chain to remove that bug is sacrilege and should not be done because it doesn't follow the principles of immutable financial services. Are bugs in the code law as well? Is it special and sacred? And is it a contract if somebody just writes spaghetti code that then gets manipulated?
Yeah, I would say code is not sacred in any way. People make mistakes all the time. Typically for normal software, in every 100 lines of code, there's usually a bug. And it's just very natural when you build software that, people make mistakes, right? So, I don't think that this code is special in any way. In the same way that maybe for example, on your iPhone or your computer, you have automatic updates all the time. And actually a lot of those updates, they're security updates. They're basically patching up code. And amongst engineers, there's this saying that basically, a lot of software is literally just patches all the way down. And, that's no different with if you have smart contracts. So, and it really kind of started with the very first one, because the interesting thing about the original DAO hack is that we now know that the original hacker, his name is Toby Honish. He was the CEO of 10x, which was one of the first ICOs. The interesting thing was that during that DAO hack, he actually went into the Slack channel at the time and was asking about this vulnerability. And I think, partly due to like people's responses to him, like he wanted to basically carry it out. So it's kind of like, even starting from this very first one, you know, people had more like, I guess, like idealistic views on what it could be compared to the fact that, just whenever you build something new, there could still be bugs. And that's still true today.
Got it. Okay. So this was the impetus for you to try to create some sort of answer, some sort of solution. How did you narrow down on the idea, coming in from the trading space? How did you figure out the right project to address this vulnerability?
My own background is that I was a quant. So I was a quant trader doing high frequency trading. Every day, like in high frequency trading, you're basically like making, hundreds of millions of dollars in trades with software. And a really interesting thing is that when I was a trader, we basically managed to never have any incidents where we had a bug that would somehow cause us to lose a lot of money. And a lot of it came down to like having very extreme software testing methods, like making sure basically battle testing all the software in a lot of different ways before putting it into production. So when I started the company, I just gathered a lot of really smart friends and tried to apply those same software testing techniques to Ethereum smart contracts. Luckily, when we started the company, all the smart contracts, they were really simple. So we could basically apply these techniques in a very exhaustive way and really make sure that these projects were safe. And over time, these projects became more complicated and we, had time to adapt to that.
Gotcha. And so what were the early days of the company like? Did you land on a services proposition, and who are some of the early folks that you worked with?
So early on, our very first thought was to maybe like make a software online that, where you could like charge $20 per automated audit. And what became apparent was that the projects early on, it would be like a couple of guys working on a brand new idea, and they would have, white paper and some rough draft of what they wanted to build. And for these early projects, what I realized is that they basically wanted to talk to us as people instead of just like run our security software, because, it's their first time building a project. They had lots of questions. They had lots of like design, considerations that they wanted to discuss with an expert. So early on, what we did was we actually just like essentially gave a lot of free advice to folks. And then also what we did was a lot of the projects, they weren't ready for production yet. So I basically just invested as an angel investor into these projects and tried to like offer some good advice. And then, over time, like some of our very first customers, like Request Network and MakerDAO and, some of these projects, they started to be kind of really well-known names. And that just sort of naturally grew from there. So at one point, MakerDAO, it was more than 50% of all the value that was in DeFi. And so, we did a lot of audits for them and sort of grew alongside them, into the sort of the really broad current phase of the market.
Maybe if you could flesh out like what an audit is and what the product is. I think it's interesting you talk about like they just wanted to talk to a person and have a technical counterpart. And I think that's super important. But when you think about the packaging of the product, the audit product, what does that look like? And what does the project get at the end of it? And maybe we can go from there.
So today, like for audits, there's three main parts. So the first part is basically the project. They share with us their GitHub. So, they share with us like the code they have. And we basically have a team of experts, usually 3 people, go through the code line by line and look for vulnerabilities. So that's sort of the first part. And then basically from the start of the project, we sort of continuously talk with the project. Usually we find different types of ways to hack the project. So we'll try to explain to them, like, here's how we would do it. And through talking to the project back and forth, usually we'll actually end up uncovering even more stuff. And also the project, it gives them a time like to sort of understand these attack vectors. Because for the engineers of the project, usually when they build it, they're mostly focused on the features. For example, if they're building like a new decentralized perpetual exchange, the team is mostly focused on building out all the features, making it really user friendly. And then when they bring it to us, we're looking at the security. So we might bring a lot of considerations that they haven't thought about. And so through this process of like talking, we usually help them to uncover more stuff and then get them to think a bit more like completely about the security side of the project. And then the third part is, so at the end, we usually will have a final report. And for the typical project, we'll end up with anywhere from 5 to 20 security findings. And then they'll basically go and fix it. And then at the end, we'll publish like a public report. And then they'll basically, at that point, have fixed everything. So that's usually the process for an audit.
Two directions I want to go. The first is to ask, what are the things that people usually make mistakes on? Like, is it a series of patterns that's similar in different projects? Like, the more of these that you do, the more you realize, oh, everyone's got reentrancy bugs or, some sort of, flash loan attack vulnerability. Like, is there 5 most likely to break things, or is every project different? So maybe we start with that.
I would say like in each category of project, there's usually like a very common bug. So for example, in DeFi protocols involving lending, there's often ways to basically create like debts in the DeFi protocol where, the amount like that you put in, it's more than the debt that you take out. And these are usually done with flash loans to basically create like a temporary imbalance in the protocol's accounting. And they tend to lead to like kind of insolvency events in these lending protocols. So usually for like a specific type of project, we'll go in and we'll already know like these are sort of the most common ways where you could hack that project. And we'll take our experience from auditing similar projects and like applying those things and basically trying to battle test it with that project. It's very similar with bridges. So as many people know, there have been a lot of bridge hacks. The reason is that bridges tend to, they have assets on one protocol and they have like liabilities on a different protocol where it's sort of, you have these receipts that represent deposits on a different chain. And so there's kind of all these different types of vulnerabilities because of mismatches in the accounting for, proving that you have a certain amount of deposits on a different chain. So usually we look for those things first, where it's kind of like common errors. And then the bulk of vulnerabilities we usually find is actually in like design. So it's in how people like wanted to design something versus what they specifically wrote. These take all sorts of like different shapes and sizes because every project they like have very different designs. But we just, for those, we usually try to like get as much documentation as possible, talk to the team a lot and understand like what they were trying to do and then see if like the code is actually doing what they're trying to do. So that's still, I would say, the bulk of the findings we have.
Reading someone else's code seems like the hardest things ever. Like I know when often developers build stuff, let's say you have a project and you've got a tech team and they spent a year and a half building things, and then you lose the CTO or something and a new CTO comes in, and often it's like, oh my goodness, I don't understand how any of this is structured. Let's rewrite everything on, from scratch on a different infrastructure or whatever. And it seems like you have to be doing the hard thing, which is really understanding how the developers of some project are structuring an idea, and you can't change it. It seems difficult and messy.
Yeah, it is very difficult. It's actually extremely dangerous and kind of a job with a very high learning curve that doesn't stop. So just to your point, most teams that get an audit, they would have worked on it already for anywhere from like 3 months to a year and a half before they get the audit. So the project, the team that worked on it, they're the ultimate experts. And when we come in, we have to find bugs that they missed. And basically repeatably do this. And so it's very hard because first, like when we come in, we need to learn how the project works. And then we only have a certain amount of time to find it, right? We don't have the luxury of working on it for 6 months. So this is probably the hardest part of being an auditor. And the thing that I think gets us better at it is that we're constantly doing it. So, every year Quantstamp does about 250 audits. Most of the people at Quantstamp, they're basically like veteran auditors. So many of the people that are helping with audits, they've worked on it for anywhere from like 3 to 6 years. So it's possible to get better at it, but because also like in Web3, people are inventing new stuff all the time and sometimes inventing new languages and like new paradigms. We just basically have to constantly keep learning. So yeah, as you said, it's basically the hardest part of, doing the auditor's job.
So 250 per year is quite a lot. And often, like the better your brand gets at audit, the more retail consumers or users of projects think that the brand is like insurance. A new project launches, you don't know anything about it. It's just some black box called Blast that you send money into that disappears. If it says audited by and it's got Quantstamp or it's got Consensus Diligence or another well-known player in the space, people feel comfortable to hand over money and put it into the black box and hope nothing on the other side goes wrong. What do you think about this dynamic of treating code auditors as almost insurance providers? Is that the wrong way to go about it? And how would you advise people?
Yeah, I would say actually the number one thing is to actually literally open the report and read it. And this is something I actually don't see a lot of people doing. So because for Quantstamp reports, we try to write it so that it's just readable by a non-technical person, especially the first page. So, when teams call us to get an audit, we can't change exactly what they're going to do after the audit. Some teams, they'll actually choose to not change anything, even if we find stuff. And so the thing that we can do is basically we write it into the report. So we'll if we feel it's pretty risky, we'll actually just write it in plain language. We'll say this is really risky. It's not really ready for production. It needs way more testing. Based on the number of bugs we found, we think there could be more. We'll write it there. And the number one thing I think is if you're going to deposit your hard-earned money into something, definitely take, the 5 minutes to open the report and actually just read the first page. Obviously, it's not really possible to catch all bugs 100% because there's, we can only spend a limited time on it. But I think over the lifespan of Quantstamp, we've had basically a greater than 99.9% success rate, at least finding things and making sure projects aren't hacked. And most of the projects that are hacked, we actually already have internal understanding that this could happen based on the risks. So we sort of try to write that in the report.
Can you give some examples where things did go wrong? I'm interested in two aspects of it. The first is, would it have been preventable? What's the reason for why something wasn't caught? And then separately, the public perception and how to deal with that.
So I think probably the biggest incident in Quantstamp history is the Nomad hack. And for Nomad, it was definitely 100% preventable. So basically in the case of the Nomad hack, now this happened about a year and a half ago. And so it's a bridge. And basically there were 3 things that could have made it preventable. So the ultimate sort of cause of the Nomad hack was that after one of the Quantstamp audits, we found a lot of findings. While the project was still fixing the findings, one of the developers in Nomad, they basically pushed a new change that was like not audited. And it was a one-line change. It was basically like sort of a fix they had to something else. And this one-line change actually caused a vulnerability that basically led to the Nomad hack. That was a case where I think could have been very preventable. And I think partly why they pushed the change was because it's a very small change. And usually projects, they don't want to like get an audit for just like one line of code, for example, because the audits, you have to plan them ahead of time. So I would say like the three sort of preventable things there was one, getting a lot of like extra code reviews, even internally in the company, so that nobody can directly push the master and then get the change just like deployed to production. The second part is just taking like a lot of teams in Web3, they're in a rush because, whether it's bridges or DeFi protocols or like layer twos, people always feel like they're competing with other projects. Maybe like at the time, I think Nomad was like competing with Wormhole and Layer Zero and trying to show that, like to get traction in the market. And so a lot of times, actually, probably every 2 to 3 weeks, Quantstamp, like behind the scenes, we usually like save a project by, finding a critical bug and then trying to like delay their release. And a lot of times, like we're able to save them because they're not like in such a rush that they've already put it into the market. So we can have extra time to look at it. So I would say like this is sort of the part where it's harder for the public to see because they just see the ultimate hack, but they don't see the sort of environments that like created it, like the lead up to the ultimate event. So
do you have to deal with that blowback, and what are the tools that you have to do it?
Yeah, I would say like luckily most of the time we're basically able to like help the projects. So probably on a weekly basis, we might save, I would say anywhere between like $1 million and $10 million in hacks pretty much on a weekly basis, because almost for every single audit, we'll find like high or critical severity bugs in these projects. So by basically helping them to fix it, we're kind of like preventing these disasters from happening. And so most of the time it's pretty smooth. Most of the time I think for Quantstamp, we prefer to just kind of like stay, like in a supporting role and basically try to help out. And then, over the years, that's been kind of very satisfying. So, yeah.
Here's a left field question. Often Web3 is framed as like an adversarial environment where you've got potentially adversarial relationships at every part of the economic stack. So when you've got blockchain protocols, there are people who are trying to create security, but they're trying to create security because there's attackers who want to break open the chain and, direct resources to themselves and kind of overrun it. And then when you go to the smart contracts part, you've got applications that other people are trying to hack or bridges that people are trying to break and pull money out from. Do you have a sense for why the presumption is so adversarial and then who the adversaries are? Like you mentioned that the DAO hacker was an early ICO CEO. Yeah, which is like, maybe don't undermine the currency that is funding your project. But what's the nature of these financial adversaries? And are there stereotypes or archetypes that you can draw that you could paint, that other people would understand?
I would say like just at the highest level, a lot of the hacks, they happen because of the experimentation. So for the things that are like really stable in the Web3 ecosystem, for example, Compound or Aave or Uniswap or like, stable coins like Tether, those have been battle tested. Like, they're extremely safe. And the hacks tend to happen more where people are experimenting. So today, there's still a lot of experiments with ZK-rollups, optimistic rollups, bridges. And so that's where they tend to happen. In terms of the archetypes, I think like at the present day, they tend to fall into like three main categories. The number one is like actually the most well publicized and well known one, which is that essentially for the last 2 years, North Korea, they've been hacking crypto projects and they've stolen more than $2 billion at this point. So, they did some of the really big hacks like the Ronin bridge hack and also the hack for Harmony. So there it's a nation state actor. They have an extremely sophisticated team. They're, not only hacking smart contracts, they're also hacking websites directly. They're, hijacking the DNS. They also, do like phishing attacks to get access to private keys. So I would say that's sort of one archetype that exists today. And basically whenever, actually on a weekly basis for Quantstamp, we try to remain on very high alert because, just like train our staff constantly and also like help to train our customers to deal with this. I think the second archetype is more like, I would say it's the developer that found something and feel like they're not going to get treated well by the project directly. And I would actually put Toby, who was sort of the DAO hacker, into this category. And so basically from what I know and from like, talking to like people that have worked with Toby in 2016 during the DAO event, he was in the Slack channel and he was trying to like talk to the developers, this company called Slockit that built the DAO contracts, and discussing the potential for this reentrancy vulnerability. And I think people didn't like take him too seriously and they didn't take like any immediate actions and they weren't really like humble about the fact that something like this could happen. And this archetype is basically these developers that maybe try to like be the white hat and see that maybe they're not really getting heard. And then they decide to instead to exploit the contract. And we've actually seen that like quite a few of these through the years where it's like when developers like try to report a bounty, often the projects don't really pay them, even if it's like a posted bounty on their website. And so it kind of like leads people into the gray hat or like black hat side. And then I would say like the third archetype essentially is sort of these like financially motivated actors. So it happened a lot during DeFi summer, right? During the rise of DeFi, where there were a lot of people on crypto Twitter that were extremely public about hacking a project and calling it, a complicated series of trades, basically classifying these hacks of user funds as just like very profitable trades.
Yeah, that goes back to the earlier point of like code is law turned into sort of this pirate ethos of if I can market manipulate some oracle into helping me steal user funds and, break collateral limits and stuff, then that's a good thing. That's like it's like a nice thing I've done to battle proof, this code, when in reality you are market manipulating a market. And I think it is satisfying that end of the day, that clear market manipulation is getting caught and kind of flushed out.
Yeah, it's satisfying. And I am really glad that this is sort of not a thing anymore. So a really good example is actually this guy called Avi Eisenberg. So he basically hacked Mango Markets and was very public about it, saying that, oh yeah, this is just a profitable trade. At the time, I think the hack was like over $60 million. This happened about a year ago, and he was actually tried in court and found guilty, and I think he's currently in jail. So the reason why like this third category of just financially motivated actors, it's highly unethical is just because lots of people, they've kind of put their hard-earned money into these protocols. And so when somebody goes and hacks them, like, often people lose their like life savings or a substantial part of their life savings. And over the last 6 years of running Quantstamp, I've talked to a lot of these people, and the stories are really sad. Like, but when I talk to the hackers, they seem to be very disconnected from this like reality that a lot of these people face. And so I'd say, like, I'm glad people are not really using this as an excuse anymore, because now like people are actually getting tried criminally for it. A lot of times recently, what's been happening is that when there's a hack and people have caught the hacker has basically like returned the funds. This has been happening a lot in the last year, I would say, because they're basically afraid of criminal prosecution, since the like code is law thing, it hasn't stood up that well in court.
Do you think that we're ever going to have much more secure, decentralized financial applications? And, I see a couple of different paths, whether it's upgrades to the programming language, and one of the claims of the Move programming language is, it's more formal and therefore there's sort of less error for mistakes. Or maybe, you end up turning into software, the audit service, in a way that lots of people can actually adopt. What are the paths to getting out of this fairly janky period, where everything is kind of scotch taped together? Like, is there a path for software-based anti-hacking tooling?
So I would say, like, the parts that are going to be really safe are the battle tested stuff, like stable coins and, compound, these type of like products that have been really battle tested through the years. So those are just going to get even more safe over time. And the parts that I think will pretty much stay always risky are the new experimental projects. And obviously, because I deal with these projects every day and I see what happens, under the hood, I'm in a sense, like I say to my friends that I'm basically working inside of the sausage factory and watching how the sausage gets made on a daily basis. And from watching how the sausage gets made, and, by founders that have good intentions, but, they're not very experienced. They just started the company. I think that part will basically always be risky. And the reason is that, like, a lot of the bugs, they're kind of like these design bugs, right? There's no way to sort of perfectly cover them. And you can kind of see it from the parallels with some of the biggest companies in the world, like, Apple and Google, Netflix. Like, they still have bugs all the time. They just constantly patch them. And, you're getting constant updates to your MacBook. A lot of those are security updates. And so even there's, constantly new 0 days that are discovered, like mistakes that, developers have made. The thing I think that will improve things is probably like AI-based debuggers. So for Quantstamp, we've been building a tool called Audit GPT, and we've started to use it in all of our audits. And basically what it does is that it translates the code into human readable language and then helps to match it against previous vulnerabilities and basically flag it to the auditors to look more into. So I think this part of the sort of security auditing stack and coding stack, it'll just get better over time. But it's not a perfect solution, but it's definitely, I think, helps the people that are writing software.
Like you say, like, there's a reason that risk capital is risk capital, and that's because it's at risk. And so when you are building something super novel and the very ground in which you're trying to build it is changing every day, then, there's no way but to be hands-on and be exposed to novel software dangers. Last question for you. You have fantastic access to like all the projects that are launching in the space because you're auditing them before they go live. If you look forward at 2024 and 2025, what kinds of things are you seeing that you think are the most exciting sectors or most exciting names for others to focus on?
Yeah, I would say probably like the three top ones is one is definitely EigenLayer. So it's a project that is allowing you to restake your staked ether and basically get more yield and contribute security to other protocols, bootstrapping on top of Ethereum's security. It's kind of a new frontier in terms of like there's so many projects building on top of EigenLayer, and we've been auditing a lot of them. It's attracting a lot of VC capital as well. So this is definitely going to be a big theme for 2024. The second one is the rise of ZK-rollups. So currently, like the biggest two rollups are Optimism and Arbitrum, which are both optimistic rollups. And for optimistic rollups, you have to wait, up to 7 days to withdraw your money. And basically, for ZK rollups, you can get instant proofs, and so that's a lot better. So I would say that's sort of a second theme. Yeah, and then third, there's a lot of exciting development happening on Solana. So it's having a huge resurgence. There's a lot of projects that were building during the bear market, which are now launching. And so we've been auditing a lot of those, and I think those are going to be pretty big for 2024.
Amazing. If our listeners want to learn more about you or about Quantstamp, where should they go?
Probably the easiest place is just quantstamp.com or our Twitter @Quantstamp. And yeah.
Fantastic. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.